Now, last time we had begun our critique of Nietzsche. There's one thing I think I forgot to do. You remember he said that there was no such thing as an altruistic or a humane motivation. He said, actually, every one of us, when we think we're trying to help people, is just responding to the will to power. He said there's a sort of do-gooder that likes manipulating people for their own benefit, the sort of social worker psychology, and that really all of motivations are the same. The Superman's motivation is to be beyond good and evil. The Superman's motivation has to do with the will to power. All of our motivations are the same. You know, when you want to reform a society, it's because you want to manipulate it. He said there's a sort of person who would essentially lose their orientation if there were no more evils to combat, because they would have then no more people they could manipulate and make over in their image. Well, I think this is a bad argument. Any argument about psychological motivation that reduces all motives to one is an oversimplification. Some of you may have encountered what we call psychological hedonism, and that is the notion that all of our activities are motivated by pleasure and pain. Now, what can we say against this? The argument usually runs something as follows. You may think that you're motivated by something other than your felt needs. And you might give us examples. You might say, here's a mother who runs into a burning house to save her child. But she wouldn't have done it unless she had wanted to, unless she had felt a need to save her child. You may think of the Christians that were thrown into the Roman arena and died for their faith. But they wouldn't have been willing to do it unless they had felt a need to die for their faith. In other words, every example you give of an altruistic motivation or a moral motivation, they will try to reduce to a felt need or a want. Well, that type of argument is really a cheating argument, isn't it? It's certainly a truism that you wouldn't do something unless you had internalized a value. That is, a creature that internalized no values would be inert like this desk. So certainly all of our actions and all of our choices do proceed from something internalized. But most of us draw a distinction between an internalized moral principle on which we act, and perhaps that moral principle commands us to do things that are not in our self-interest at all, such as to lay down our life for our children or lay down our life for our religion. We don't do that because we want to in the ordinary sense of the word. No one wants to be torn apart by lions in the Roman arena, or no one wants to be burnt to death in a house. Most of us would classify as wants things that give us pleasure, things that we aspire to because we think that they're attractive. And moral principles are duties that override those pleasures. It becomes just a word game. You have to say human beings are motivated by two different kinds of wants. There's wants sub one, which are self-serving and lead to our pleasure, and there are wants sub two, which are internalized moral principles in which we may sacrifice our wants or even sacrifice our lives on the altar of saving a life, on the altar of not betraying a friend, and so forth. So once you reduced all motivations to a single thing, there's always a sleight of hand at play. There's always a blurring of distinctions that's covered by an attractive word. Just by labelizing acting on my moral principles a want, you don't convert them into, let's say, what I do when I have an ice cream soda. Yes, I want that. But I may give up an ice cream soda for Lent if I'm a Catholic. To call that a want when I give up something I want for a moral principle is, of course, just to blur a distinction. We would say, well, all right, you can use the word want in an eccentric way. Most of us use the word want when we're attracted to something because of pleasure. And we call a sacrificial act, laying down our lives when we feel we ought to do so for a moral principle. Really, all you are saying is that we are not under the control of a hypnotist. I mean, how could I do anything if I had nothing that came from within me, nothing internalized? But we know the difference between people who are sociopaths and have internalized no moral principles and people like ourselves who have internalized moral principles. Yes, no human being, unless they're under the control of a hypnotist, just responds to something outside themselves. All activity comes from something within, from something you've internalized. But all you're doing is blurring the distinction between a sociopath who internalizes nothing except lust and wanting advantage and, wanting to get ahead of other people and self-serving objectives, and the person who has internalized other regarding moral principles. You see the point I'm making? Now, that will help you if you ever run into a psychological egoist, someone who tells you there is no difference between selfishness and altruism, because they are both actions that you pursue because something you've internalized. That's true, of course, but so what? Internalizing moral principles gives you a whole new dimension on life than if you don't internalize any moral principles. Now, what of Nietzsche's argument? He says that no one really has any motivation except the will to power. Well, what's the cash value of that argument? Certainly, you never give a moral advice without wanting to influence someone. That is, you don't do it to waste your breath, do you? So the only word of truth in what Nietzsche is saying is that any time that I interact with another person and I have a serious motive, I probably want to influence their behavior. So you can say that reduces everything to the will to power. Everything is a matter of trying to assert mastery over another person. But my heavens, sometimes we give people advice that would actually give us less control over them. That is, parents try to raise their children in a way that they will eventually be independent of the parent. Unless there's something wrong with you, you don't want your children to remain dependent on you forever. And you send them to college, you do all sorts of things that will eventually free them of the need for you to run their lives for them, don't you? And to say that when a parent tries to raise a child in such a way as to make them autonomous, you're just exercising your will to power, merely means that we would have to say, well, you're using words in an eccentric way. Most of us want to draw distinctions, and we would draw a distinction between a parent who purposely keeps their child from ever becoming an adult and glories in the fact that their child is forever a child and dependent on them, and a parent that raises their child to be an autonomous human being in the full realization that someday the child will say to them, no, I don't agree. I'm going to run my life as I would like to run it. You see the point? So these are purely verbal victories, and I think that Nietzsche is to be criticized on this point. What if I said to Nietzsche, lying behind the will to power is always altruism? Well, that would be a similarly silly argument. I could say that anyone who has mastered anyone else had an unconscious motive of trying to benefit them. And therefore, even Hitler was trying to benefit the Jews, Here he was, at one level he was trying to exterminate them, but he must have had an unconscious drive that he was unaware of, that he was really trying to help them. Well, we would say this was madness, wouldn't we? I mean, once you start saying that people have unconscious drives that are the opposite of what they think they have, there may be a certain truth in it, but it can't be always true. I'm sure there have been parents who are too clinging. If you ask them if they were trying to benefit their children, they'd say yes. But if you studied their behavior, you see that they're really trying to keep their children dependent on themselves even as adults. And that's a very different line of parental behavior than a parent who raises their child to be autonomous in full knowledge that that means eventually they will move away from you and interact with you as an adult. rather than as a subordinate child. So I don't think we should be intimidated by Nietzsche's argument that we fundamentally are no different from the Superman. We're just less talented. That the only human motivation is the desire to control other people. Certainly all moral advice is intended to influence conduct. There would hardly be any reason for giving it or not. But sometimes we give people moral advice to actually enhance their autonomy and make them less malleable by our own will. And that's a real distinction, whatever we think, or whatever we label it. Soul sickness, you recall, we're supposed to have a metaphysical residue. That is, the only reason we believe that people are equal is that we have this residual hang-up from when we thought everyone had a soul. Who knows historically? You can't rerun history. Would we ever have developed a cosmopolitan humanism unless we had at one time all shared a religious belief that all people were children in the eyes of God? Well, we know that that wasn't a sufficient belief to have humanism, don't we? Did any of you see the film The Mission? It was a film done some years ago, The Mission. It was about South America. And the Pope had divided South America between Portugal and Spain because they were both Catholic countries and he didn't want them having a war over who controlled what part of Latin America. And so Portugal was left mainly with Brazil. And that meant that some territory that had formerly been Portuguese had moved to Spain. And of course that causes the drama of the movie. That is, Portugal had forbade slavery and Spain had not. So suddenly the Jesuits, who were working with an indigenous people in Latin America, found that they were under Spanish rule and they had been treating these people as human beings, and now the viceroy in Peru in Spanish South America wanted to use them as slaves. You see the point? So this created quite a moral dilemma, didn't it? So they went to the Spanish court with these Indians and they had them sing beautifully, and the reaction of the viceroy was, well, even parrots can sing. That doesn't show they're human. So even the belief that there was such a thing as a soul did not coerce us into thinking that everyone had a soul. That is, their view was that these Indians had maybe an inferior kind of soul, but it was certainly not the same kind of soul as Spaniards had, and therefore they didn't deserve freedom rather than slavery. You see the argument. But who knows, maybe the concept of the soul did help us all begin to regard other people as worthy of moral concern. Once I no longer believe in the soul, but I do believe that people have moral concern. And whether that belief survives, I don't think is much dependent on religion. The reason it survives is that you raise children in a certain way. And you raise children hopefully without racism, so they don't think people of a different color aren't worthy of moral concern. You hopefully raise them without classism, so that they don't think people who are poorer than they are just welfare bums and are some type of inferior person. You try to raise them in a way that introduces humane principles, and you either succeed or you don't. And human nature is very malleable. If you're lucky and you set an example of humane behavior for your children, and you keep them from joining a gang that sets one ethnic group against another, if you're lucky, humane ideals survive. It's a matter of acculturation. And once humanism gets going, it has its own steam. And you can either keep it alive or you can't. There are plenty of historical cases where humanism has been snuffed out by a class ideology, as in Stalin's Russia, or by a racial ideology in South Africa, or by a materialistic ideology among certain people in New Zealand. And humanists have to fight against that. But merely because the idea of a cosmopolitan humanism arose with religious belief doesn't mean that its future depends on pretending we're still religious. We can try and acculturate our children as humanists or not. I think there's some truth in what There is a recent book by a Straussite, maybe his name will come to me in a moment, but he published a book called, I think it was The Higher Learning in America, or The Degeneration of the Higher Learning in America. And in it he pointed out that many young people today have a greater difficulty and accepting that love should be afforded to all people because, of course, so often their parents desert them for self-serving reasons. You know, that if you wanted to name a big threat to raising children to have humane ideals, here their parents tell them that they love them, and then when the child is 7, the parents split up because one of them sees someone they would prefer to sleep with. And they feel somewhat let down, you know, that these people who claim to have their interests at heart seem to have a very different agenda. So I can imagine threats to humane ideals. It may be that we're raising children who are more cynical than they were in the past, and you can understand why they might be. But these are the sort of things that will determine the fate of humanism. We have no head start over any other morality, but I don't think we have any head start over us. We'll either socialize our children successfully to be humane or we won't. And I don't think we need a belief in God or the soul to do the job. Remember all the times that a belief in God has not convinced you to treat all people in a civilized way, but has convinced you that the other person is the infidel who ought to be converted by the sword. So religion has a very mixed record in terms of promoting humanism, does it not? And I don't feel that I have to put all of my eggs in that basket. Well then, these are mainly answering Nietzsche's arguments against us. I don't think that I suffer from soul sickness. I don't think that all of my motives are a disguised will to power. We got on to Nietzsche. We said that he had no real reason or no good scenario as to how you could bring about a cosmopolitan society ruled by supermen. I missed one point last time. At one point he says maybe the best way to breed a race of supermen is to have intermarriages between Jews and the Prussian nobility. Of course, this is Nietzsche's sense of humor. He knew how anti-Semitic the Prussian nobility were, and he's needling them here. And he says, after all, the Prussian nobility have the soldierly virtues, but they're incurably stupid, while the Jews are very clever but have no military tradition. So if you want to get a real race of supermen, you should, you know, all marry Jews. But that is not meant as a serious proposal. That is meant to take the mickey out of German nationalism, is it not, and shows Nietzsche's sense of humor. But we said last time conquest wasn't very promising. It doesn't seem to bring an elite to rule, and we talked about that a bit. Then there's the problem of identifying supermen. You remember how eccentric Nietzsche's own ability to identify supermen was. That is, he left out Newton, he left out Gauss, he had qualms about Shakespeare, he included Alcibiades, he included Frederick IV of Hohenstaufen, people that we today would think of as pretty second-rate. Well, if you don't have supermen brought to power by conquest, how are supermen to recognize and cooperate with one another? How do we solve the problem of recognition? Is there some sort of fraternity? That is, was Michelangelo supposed to organize some secret group? And then he would choose, let's say, oh, I don't know, Raphael, or he would choose fellow geniuses, and they would get together and decide on who would be a genius. Well, I think you can see that this is rather fanciful. Many people who we think of as geniuses today, no one recognized as a genius in their lifetime. Isn't that correct? You know, and people that we think of as incurably second-rate today, like Meyerbeer, were thought of as extremely great composers in their time. So if Nietzsche has a formula by which the great can recognize one another, it's not evident to me. Certainly, self-recognition that you're great won't work. That is, if you've spent a year in New York, as I have, and you go through Greenwich Village, you'll find that every third person thinks they're a creative genius because they paint themselves blue and roll across a canvas. Well, their credentials don't impress me very much. And if we say to people, you can declare yourself a genius, what is the practical effect of this? We've admitted that we can't refute Nietzsche's private morality. Even if I show him that he has no scenario for organizing a society ruled by supermen, he could still stick to the private morality of the superman. And what would lead this to in practice? Since some people may have a genuine awareness that they are supermen, and therefore they could murder a drunk in an alley to get the money to paint, according to Nietzsche. But for every one of them, there are 10 people who are deluded into thinking they're supermen who have no talent at all. So the main practical effect of telling supermen they had these prerogatives would be to increase New York's already robust murder rate, which doesn't seem to me a very significant contribution to our civilization. Well then, I think I'll sum up that there are some things we can learn from Nietzsche. I think that he is right that before morality gets off the ground, we have to decide what forms of life are significant enough to enter to the circle of moral concern. You remember the ladder I put on the blackboard. I think he's right. And I'm not sure that I have any logical argument that ought to coerce Nietzsche in not drawing the line where he does. That is, if you really dislike ordinary people and have no sympathy with their sufferings and only admire creative geniuses, I don't know of any way I can use logic to say, here's a contradiction. You ought to put everyone into the circle of moral concern. But as you see, I do think I can still argue with him. I can say, well, I can't change your heart, but what you say about a cosmopolitan Europe ruled by supermen is just nonsense. And what you say about keeping the masses illiterate is nonsense if you really want to free the creative talent that's in the masses. So I can catch him in self-contradictions. I can say, the consequences of what you recommend are not how you paint them. This would not maximize genius, that would actually minimize the expression of genius. I can do all of that, but perfection value does come before moral value. I think he is right on the issue of free will and determinism. At present, at least, it's an existential choice that we all have to make, and we have no rational guide in making it. I agree with him that psychology should not be corrupted by ethics, that if you study human beings, you study them warts and all, and you don't try to gild the lily by finding nothing bad in them. That isn't what psychology is about. I do believe that we have to look ourselves in the face and see if the only reason we hold humane ideals is that we have a rosette view of humanity. You know, you run into Quakers who seem to think that in order to want to help everybody, they have to believe everybody is really good at heart. Well, I've met a lot of people who weren't really good at heart. You know, if that's the only way I can embrace humanism and admit everyone to my circle of moral concern, I stand on sand. There's a certain feminist who has to believe that the only reason women do anything corrupt is the influence of men. They will find, I think, exceptions to this, and if that's what their feminism is based on, they're building on sand. There are young Marxists who have to think that every worker is a proletarian hero. I can show them some workers that don't resemble proletarian heroes, but are wife beaters and mean to their children and, you know, pretty degraded. You can always say that's capitalism, of course. I mean, there's always a way out. But you either feel that all human beings should not suffer unjustly as a moral principle, or you don't. If you have to look at the world through rose-tinted spectacles, then you're fair game to Nietzsche. I want to make one final criticism of Nietzsche, and that is all humanistic ethics is corrupted if you put one ball ahead of all the others. Now, what I mean by that is what I reminded you of earlier, that I think that any humanist really has 6 great goods, and we have trouble doing trade-offs between them. And one of these goods is trying to help people be happier. That's a good objective, but it's not the only good objective. I would be willing to sacrifice a certain amount of my own happiness if I were more successful in the pursuit of truth. I don't think I would be willing to throw myself into abject misery, but I think often the pursuit of truth means a lot of sleepless nights. I think that justice is important. I can imagine ways of maximizing the happiness of a community, let's say by giving one person over to the Gestapo. You know, a German officer has been killed, and they're going to cut the food ration unless I hand them the culprit, and I don't know who did it. So I select one person to be tortured to death by the Gestapo. Well, maybe that does increase the happiness of the community, but to hand an innocent person over for a crime they didn't do outrages our sense of justice, doesn't it? I believe the creation of beauty is important. I think that, you know, it may be that a certain tension is necessary to create great art. And I'm not sure that I would want to psychoanalyze Beethoven if turning him into a transformed person had meant he couldn't have composed his music. I take a certain delight in human diversity, and I don't really want all pre-industrial societies made into copies of my own. Let them alone. I mean, if they're happy as Amazonian Indians, let them alone. We don't want necessarily to turn them all into cost accountants. Not particularly if you've met a few cost accountants. So there are a number of important great goods that humanism should hold high, and it's always a temptation to simplify by putting one ahead of all the others. You know, Kant did this with justice. If you're in charge of a prison and an army is coming, you execute everyone who has the death penalty immediately, so justice will be served. Or there are the utilitarians who say sacrifice everything to the happiness ball. Well, I can't agree with that. You know, I think there are certain terrible injustices that I would not do even if the greatest happiness would get a slight rise thereby. Nietzsche puts the beauty ball ahead of everything else. That is, he says, you know, what I admire is the creative artist. And I think you always get a perversion of humanism if you pick one of these 6 great goods and set it up as the arbiter of the other 5. You know, the only thing important is beauty, and if we have more beauty in a cruel and savage society, well, so what? You know, the only great thing is pleasure, and if we have less art and we have less justice in a society of lotus eaters, well, go ahead with it. You see my point. So I think that Nietzsche illustrates a permanent message that I want to get across to you, and that is ethics to some degree is messy. That is, that if you have a society, as Aristotle put it, in which all 6 of these great goods are respected, and you have trade-offs between them you can live with, be happy. Because it's probably impossible to find a neat logical formula that tells us how much justice to sacrifice to how much happiness to how much beauty. You know, be happy if all 6 of these things are cherished and we have trade-offs we can live with. But don't take the simplistic way out of taking one of these 6 great goods and saying, oh, it's the preeminent one, and the others are only worth seeking insofar as they are means to that as an end. Everyone see the point? Well then, any final comments you would like to make on Nietzsche? And how I feel that one can argue with Nietzsche despite not having a truth test up my sleeve. I can't say to Nietzsche, there's a farm laid up in the world of farms that shows I'm right about justice and you're wrong about justice. I can't say to Nietzsche, there's a scripture called the Bible that shows that my ethics are in accord with the will of God and your ethics aren't.
Sorry, I just like to list the 6 things again.
Pardon?
I only got 5 of those things you listed. You could list the 6.
Oh, 6.
Yeah.
The last one was delight and diversity. Oh, I think one of them was the degradation of the human being. You remember, let's imagine that you could have exquisite pleasure let us imagine psychology found that the most delicious pleasure, if only we freed your unconscious impulses, was sadism, you know. And we said, well, we've invented a machine. We can plug you into this and you can have the illusion of torturing innocent people all day. But the people are fictitious. Well, that would be a utilitarian heaven, wouldn't it? Everyone would be maximizing their happiness and there'd be no victims. But it would be demeaning. You know, it turns human beings into something awful. So the integrity of human nature, if you want to call it that, I think that's a great good as well. I don't know, can I fault someone who finds pleasure in tearing the wings off of flies all day? For all I know, flies feel no pain. For all I know, he finds it exquisitely pleasurable and beautiful. But there's still something demeaning about it, isn't there? So I think another thing we have is that there are certain things that reduce human beings to animals. Any other questions then about Nietzsche before we go on to Sartre? Well then, let's throw the floor open. I think I assigned you Marjorie Green's little book, Introduction to Existentialism, and a couple of chapters on Sartre. How does Marjorie Green define existentialism? That is, what is an existentialist? She seems to say that at least Sartre's brand of existentialism depended on two propositions. Did anyone notice what these were? Well, I have them on the blackboard. And that is that anything is allowable and anything is possible. And these are the two propositions that supposedly the existentialists assume. Now we'll see what they mean by that in a moment. But I think the best way to start to see what Sartre is about is that in a sense he democratizes Nietzsche. I think that Nietzsche thought only a small elite had the genetic potential to be value creators and to create great beauty and to create a persona for themselves. You know, most of us just sit around and we're molded by our society. But the Superman transcends society. That is, he is a transvaluator. His creative impulse is so strong he creates new art forms. He creates new political regimes like Napoleon. So if you read Nietzsche, it's only a small elite that really can fashion their own characters and fashion their own values and fashion their own perspective on the world. And the rest of us are merely essentially a result of our socialization and our parental upbringing, right? And this is one of the marks of our mediocrity, that we never rise above that. Sartre, in a sense, says that every human being is capable of being like Nietzsche's Superman. That all of us have the capacity of rising above the determinations of our society and the determinations of our parental upbringing, and that all of us have the capacity to live a life of self-creation. Now, how does he arrive at that democratization of Nietzsche? That is, you could call Nietzsche the aristocrat and Sartre the democrat of existentialism. They both agree that certain human beings can create their own natures or their own personalities and can rise above societal influence. Nietzsche thinks that only the great artist or the great genius is capable of that. Sartre thinks it's part of the human condition. Now, in order to understand how Sartre democratizes Nietzsche, we have to look at those two propositions. The belief that anything is allowable and the belief that anything is possible. Now, the first proposition is a proposition that you should be familiar with. It's radical ethical skepticism. It's the notion that there is no objectivity in ethics and therefore no limits on what you do or your behavior from duty. I take it duty always tells us that our behavior is limited. We're supposed to walk a certain path. And that's the path that duty prescribes. And you remember how Nietzsche said this was a form of tyranny. You know, that you shouldn't include a moral leg to the stool of self-perfection. He criticized morality. He said morality always tends to become autonomous. And a part of you, namely your conscience, becomes your master and starts telling you what to do. And you compromise your great art because it would be cruel to lose 100 peasants to build a cathedral. So morality is always an enemy of freedom. Well, in a sense, Sartre seems to accept that. And he essentially says, first, you may remember from my lectures on St. Thomas that Sartre thinks he has a disproof for the existence of God, does he not? You remember he said the concept of God was of something that was both necessary goodness and contingent goodness. And these are mutually incompatible concepts. You may recall this when I taught you St. Thomas. Well, I'm not going to review that material. I don't think anyone has a proof of the non-existence of God. And Sartre's proof is absurd. That is, Aquinas doesn't say that God is his own cause. He says God is uncaused, does he not? But despite the fact that Sartre can't disprove the existence of God, there may be good reasons for not believing in God. You may not believe in the argument from faith. You may not believe in Aquinas' 5 proofs. So let us concede him for the sake of argument that his proof is invalid, but let's assume that a rational person won't believe in God. The next step in Sartre's argument is that unless you believe in God, you can't believe in the doctrine of essences, including an essence of man. Well, that seems to me also a shortcut. Plato didn't base his notion that there was a form of humanity or a form of human society on a belief in God, did he? That is, he argued that there was a world of forms based on logic. He thought he had a logical argument. He thought, well, you can classify all the people in this room together despite their differences, so you must have a general idea of what it is to be human, and just as you have a general idea of what it is to be a straight line, and you can't reduce that to a sense image. I can't draw a perfectly straight line on the blackboard, can I? So we must get it from a non-material world. There must be in the world of forms a concept of what it is to be a straight line. And everything that we draw on the blackboard is an imperfect imitation. And similarly, you're all imperfect imitations of the form of human being. And if we master the divided line, we can find out what perfects human nature. So I don't accept that once you reject God, you necessarily reject the notion that there is an essence of humanity. But there may be good reasons for accepting that. I think the doctrine of forms or essences is subject to devastating rational critique. I think that Aristotle and subsequent thinkers have found good reasons to say that the only type of human beings exist are the human beings in this room. And there is no form of human being, there is no perfect human being sitting in the world of forms somewhere that we can study. So let's grant Sartre that although he oversimplifies the case, there is nothing like Plato's essence of humanity. His next step is that if there is no essence of humanity, there is no ethical truth. Well, there are many thinkers who would disagree with that. I don't think this year you studied Mill, did you, in this course? But Mill thought that even though he was a modern man and a physicalist, he only believed in physically existing human beings. He didn't believe that there was a perfect idea of humanity in the mind of God. He didn't believe there was a perfect man that we could copy in the world of forms. He still thought he had a proof that we ought to behave in a certain way. That is, he thought he had a logical proof of the proposition that we ought to maximize the happiness of the greatest number. I'll only be able to say in brief that I think the proof doesn't hold water. So while there are people who would say that they could make a case for objectivity in ethics without the doctrine of essences, I think they're wrong. You know, I don't think you can convict anyone who is evil-intentioned of a mistaken logic. Logic can't show anything about facts, and I don't think it can show that you have to reject certain elitist moral principles. So let's give Sartre that. Then he leaps to the conclusion that if there is no ethical truth, we must be nihilists. That is, if there's no objectivity in ethics, it's a matter of indifference whether you cut off your ear like Van Gogh or whether you give food to a beggar. It's a matter of indifference whether you save a child that runs out into traffic or whether you push a child out into traffic. Now, you may remember in the first two lectures I gave you, I branded this the nihilist fallacy, didn't I? I said even if there's no truth test in ethics, we don't have to treat our principles as if they had failed a truth test. You know, there's a truth test in the realm of fact, and I can show you that certain things are hallucinations that are not worthy of your regard. If you hallucinate an oasis in the desert, when you get there you'll get a mouthful of sand, won't you? And if you have a veridical sense experience of an oasis, when you get there you'll get a mouthful of water, won't you? So we can use prediction in the realm of fact to separate things that flunk the truth test and things that pass it. But if there is no truth test in ethics, there are neither passes nor fails. That is, your moral principles are worth exactly what they are to you. You know, a hallucination deceives you. What do your moral principles deceive you about? They're about what ought to be, not what is, aren't they? And they don't deceive you about your inner self. They help define what you are. That is, I would like to think that I have a very different nature than someone who never does an altruistic act. And my moral principles distinguish me from other people. And I take pride in that distinction if I live up to my principles. So I do not think that lack of objectivity in ethics really means that anything is allowable. It seems to me that you may reject objectivity in ethics and you may reject the notion of ethical truth, and you may still say, I'm deeply committed to humane ideals and I would lay down my life for them. After all, I don't believe there's objective duty, objective beauty. But I respect an artist who says, although beauty may not be objective, I have internalized the concept of an object that I find beautiful and I'm willing to starve in a garret for 10 years to paint it. You know, he doesn't have to believe beauty is objective. He's drunk on beauty, on a particular concept of beauty. He knows there are other concepts. But something that's beautiful is what governs his life. What you think to be right and wrong can govern your life. And you don't need a truth test sitting up in the sky that stamps it A number 1. Your commitment to it, if it's deep, that's all you need to say, here I stand, as Martin Luther did. You know, I stand on humane ideals and Hitler is my enemy. I don't have to have a truth test that tells me my ideals are objectively right. So I don't think the proposition anything is allowable is a logical proposition. You may react to the loss of objectivity in ethics by being very depressed. That is, you may have been raised in a household with the 10 Commandments, and you thought these were given by God to Moses, and they were objective things that you had to obey whether you wanted to or not. And then you lose your faith. You think, well, this is pretty crazy, really, to believe that a long time ago a man went off and saw a burning bush and picked up tablets with, you know, the 10 Commandments engraven on them, and I'm not sure there is a God anyway. Well, if all your life has been governed by religion and you lose your faith, life then may seem meaningless to you, and one thing seems no better than another. But that is a psychological problem. That is, there have been plenty of principled people who didn't believe in God who were not cynics about ethics. And it may be that if you have all your life naively believed in ethical truth, and you become disabused of that notion, you then feel that everything is worthless. You know, that nothing is any more worth doing than anything else. But that is a psychological reaction. If you have a good heart, it is always worth helping other people. And you don't have to have the Bible to tell you to do it. You do it because those are your principles, and here I stand. So I don't think that we are in the position of nihilism just because objectivity has disappeared in ethics. Now, what about Sartre's other proposition, that anything is possible? Now this brings us to the concept of absolute freedom. And existentialism is peculiar in that if you torpedo its concept of freedom, the whole edifice falls apart. That's not true of most philosophical systems. That is, if you convince Plato there was no such thing as free will, he'd have said, well, look, there's still the world of forms, and there's still the divided line, and you can ascend the divided line and find the truth about good and evil, you know. And John Stuart Mill was a determinist. And he said, you know, well, I don't believe in free will, but I still think I can prove that the greatest good of the greatest number is how you should govern your life. Existentialism is different because they build their case for being philosophically unique on the concept that other philosophical schools have not properly interpreted human autonomy. And that is supposed to be their distinctive contribution. Now you see, first, we've already said you have autonomy from any moral principles, don't you? Because they think that the fact that moral principles aren't objective means that they have lost meaning. They now go on to say anything is possible in this sense. If you become aware of an influence on your conduct, you can transcend it. That is, here the priest in the confessional has controlled your conduct by telling you what's sinful. But you become aware that God doesn't exist, and that priest has no more right to give you moral advice than anyone else. Well, now you're free, aren't you? You're free of the confessional. Or you become aware that you feel guilty for dancing on Sunday merely because your parents were conservative Presbyterians and made you feel that way. Well, once you become aware, you can transcend it. You can say, now I understand why I felt guilty about dancing on Sunday, and now that I brought this to conscious awareness, I'll dance. And I realize it's pretty stupid to feel guilty just because my parents thought it was wrong. So the notion is that by self-awareness, by having a full knowledge of the cultural patterns, the parental influences that have restricted your freedom, by bringing these to consciousness, once they're conscious, you can deal with them. And then you can transcend them. It may cost you something, but you can do it if you have the authenticity to do so. That is, you may not have the courage. You may find it too hard. You might say, I still feel guilty about dancing on Sunday, even though I know it's stupid. But that just shows that you really haven't convinced yourself. I mean, you don't feel guilty at walking on Sunday. You don't feel guilty at breathing on Sunday. Or again, you might say, well, maybe it is just because I live in a materialist society that I always want a bigger car. But if you become aware of how stupid and arbitrary that is, you should then be happy with a car as just a vehicle of transportation. So authenticity enters in. That is, you can either try to be authentic, and that means transcending all of the arbitrary influences that have limited your freedom and becoming a person for whom any one thing is possible. Or, of course, you can show inauthenticity. That is, you can just retreat into the business of being a determined human being, but you'll find that difficult. You know, it wasn't hard to go to confession when you really believed in God. You feel like an idiot in going if you don't believe in God. You see the point? I mean, you might do it as show to escape the Spanish Inquisition, but it's you'll be a different person. Or you may still, you could hardly teach your own children it was wicked to dance on Sunday. Maybe you can't do it because you can't shake off your parental upbringing. But you would be a very curious personality if you'd started trying to inculcate your own children with that sort of attitude, wouldn't you? So he would say it may not be as hard as you think. If you think about the influences on your conduct and become aware of them, you can transcend them and become a truly free human being and become an authentic person who has absolute freedom. Well, next time I'll begin our critique of Sartre. I'm only giving Sartre one full lecture, so we'll probably end our coverage of Sartre about halfway through next time, and that means that we'll be talking about A.J. Ayer, does it not?